Hello, everybody. Welcome to GoodTech with IDCA. I'm Elizabeth Perry. We're going to be talking about ethics and technology. This is Goran Wagstrom, CEO at IDCA. I'm also on the founding team. And before we introduce our guest today, we'd like to talk a little bit, just introduce IDCA. Goran, would you like to tell people what IDCA is?
Thank you. The IDCA is developed to protect people's privacy rights online. It provides a safe place to communicate, share, and store between families, friends, colleagues, and private groups.
Great. So let's see. Let's introduce our guest today. Today we're going to be talking with Alexander Hanff. Alexander Hanff is privacy guru, earliest days of the World Wide Web. He's been around since the internet was what the internet was supposed to be, and one of the world's most vocal privacy advocates, and one of the forces behind GDPR, as we know, in Europe. Alexander?
Hi, Elizabeth. Nice to be here.
Great. So why don't we just get started? This is going to be the ABCs of digital privacy. And a lot of times we talk to people and they don't even know what privacy means. Can you tell us, can you define the privacy for us?
Oh, start with an easy question, huh?
Right.
Defining privacy is very difficult because privacy is deeply personal. So we all see privacy in different ways. It's also deeply cultural. So different places in the world see privacy in different ways. One of the things that we've been struggling with as academics for the past 20, 30 years is to find a good definition for privacy. We tend to settle on privacy as being just basically the right to be left alone, the right not to have your private space, your thoughts, your speech, your communications intruded on.
Okay. And so when we're talking about digital privacy, I'll tell you what when I talk about IDCA, when I talk about the importance of privacy, a lot of times I get the answer, I don't care. I have nothing to hide. How do you respond to that?
Everybody has something to hide. I mean, I talk about privacy in context, speeches I give across the world. I talk about bodily privacy, the fact that we all wear clothes. And when it gets warm in the summer, we don't get naked, we turn on the air conditioning. You know, none of us will go to a public bathroom which doesn't have doors on the stall. Yeah, we all keep our bank accounts private. We all lock our doors at night to our homes. We lock the doors in our cars so people won't take our cars. Privacy is not about having something to hide. Privacy is about just having the right not to be interfered with. So to say we have nothing to hide, we all have something to hide. Yeah? It doesn't mean that we've done something wrong. It just means that we have a desire for other people not to know everything about us.
Right.
Can I add
Please.
to that? I mean, as you said, Alexander, also that people often says, I don't have anything to hide. But I think it's also important to realize that this is a value that we have to protect. It's not just about hiding something or having not something to hide. But that also means that if you lose your privacy, then you lose the control over yourself, about your personnel, about your actions, about your thoughts and so forth. And when you lose that, then you lose the fundament for our lives.
Definitely. I mean, privacy is one of the core fundamental rights. If we don't have privacy, then we don't have freedom, because if we know we're being surveilled, under psychology, we have what we call the Hawthorne effect, which states that when we know we're being surveilled, we change our behavior. So we're no longer behaving as natural people. We're behaving in a way which is different to how we would normally behave. And we see this very clearly in places like China with the social credit system. China introduced the social credit system not as a means to be able to just monitor the population, but also as a means to control the population. because when people know that they're being watched, they change their behavior. So they change the people they associate with. They change the things they say. They change the things that they're looking at or reading. Yeah. They change the places that they go. So all these freedoms we take for granted, freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom of thought and opinion, freedom of religion, all of these freedoms which we take for granted day to day in Europe and the rest of the Western world, they disappear if we don't have privacy, because we're no longer behaving as free people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we hear it in the media now, right? It's like all over the news. It's the watchword. It's the privacy is the new black. Everybody's talking about it. Why is it so important today? And are we just waking up, or is it just another media thing to do?
It's always been important, but it's been difficult. I've been working in this space for about 12 years now. It's been very difficult raising awareness because we tend to have strong loyalty to the big digital brands and other brands that we use on a day-to-day basis. And we tend to want to do the biggest, the next big trend, and use the next big app and use the next big service. And the convenience that's afforded to us by that often tempts people to overlook the other things that are going on in the background. What has happened is since 2015, starting with Edward Snowden, there have been a number of revelations, and certainly the increase in data breaches, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, etc. There's been a great deal of focus now on these issues and how they're impacting us as a society, how it's impacting our democracy, such as the fake news and the impact that's having on elections and governance, but also how that's impacting us as individuals as well. So with the focus of, or certainly the increase in news on these issues over the past 3 to 4 years, we're seeing more people becoming aware of these issues. It's never been a case that people didn't care about privacy. In fact, in many of the tens of thousands of people I've spoken to about privacy, when they know what's going on, they're absolutely horrified. The issue has been a lack of awareness prior to these more recent revelations. And as we can see now, when this awareness exists, then people start to rebel against these issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And but also I think, if I back a little bit to how we've always thought about, I mean, you were around then as well as I was when we got the internet and the web. I mean, everybody thought that this was changing the world to the better, and that we should democracy should boost, freedom of speech was there, the world would be safer and prosper. But when you see the results of how it is right now, I mean, we have the largest surveillance and stalking society that we ever had, and we're constantly watched on and offline. It's a perfect place for hate and divide.
And this is a little bit disappointing as well, because as you said in the beginning, I mean, the thing that I'm a computer scientist by trade. I moved into policy and law about 12 years ago. But for me, the internet way back in the beginning, before the web existed, was all about sharing knowledge. Yeah, it's all about empowering people, closing down borders, making the world a smaller place, removing prejudice, etc. Being able to communicate, something as a species we have this deep desire to do. Communication is one of the oldest instincts that we have as a species. And the internet really enabled that. But unfortunately, what came with that was commoditization, was capitalism, was control, and surveillance, and all these other issues that came as well. And that's really a byproduct of technology. Technology has evolved to make our lives more convenient, to enrich us in many ways, but at the same time, the responsibility hasn't come with that. I tend to think of us as not really being mature enough yet for the technologies that we've now created as a society.
So do you think it has to do with the ad-driven economy? I mean, you think that's the culprit?
The ad-driven economy is definitely one of the big problems. E-commerce developed very early on with the internet, and the ability to be able to track users using things like cookies, flash cookies, little transparent pixels, and so on and so forth. The ability to track people from one site to the next was gold dust for marketers. And yourself as a marketer, this type of data to be able to find out what people are interested in and what people are doing can be a very effective means of selling advertising. With that came the promise of substantial advertising gains and advertising revenues, but those revenues have been limited to a handful of companies. And the rest of the ecosystem sees very, very little of that. So there's two sides to this problem. We have the one side where there are significant revenues, which of course drives companies to move down this path. And at the other side, we have a significant lack of enforcement. Despite the fact that we've had very strong laws since 1995, there's been a general lack of enforcement of these laws, which has allowed companies to break these laws wholesale without any consequences.
Right. So, I noticed something very interesting that nobody has mentioned any names yet. Who are we talking about?
There's so many. I mean, you've got the Facebooks, Googles, Amazon. The list is endless. Audience Science, Blue Carver. I could go on for days naming companies who are working in the digital ad tech space in ways which are completely unethical, and in many cases completely illegal. Certainly in Europe under European law.
Yeah, you see all the companies that you never sign up with, like the scrapers, for instance, that scrapes tons of information that's sold to other people. I mean, the people that we know about them, maybe we sign up with.
And again, as I said, this is down to a lack of enforcement. We've had very strong laws on data protection in Europe, certainly, and on e-privacy since 1995 and 2002, respectively. But there's been a lack of enforcement. There's been a lack of desire and a lack of harmonization of law across the world in order to make this effective. And of course, many of these big companies don't exist in Europe. They exist in the US, in Silicon Valley, and tend to assume that they're not subject to the jurisdiction of our laws. We try and deal with this now through the GDPR, where we have extraterritorial scope. But again, it can often be very difficult for data subjects, people like you and I, to be able to enforce our rights or to be able to assert our rights and file the complaints with the regulators who would then enforce those rights.
So let's talk a little bit about what are we talking about when we talk about a data breach? What is actually happening to your data that we should be concerned about?
Technically speaking, a data breach is any use of data in a way which is not permitted by law. So it doesn't necessarily mean that your service has been compromised by external hackers, such as all the things we see with the Marriott hotel scandal this week, Dunkin' Donuts, another issue this week. But a data breach is any unauthorized processing of personal data under the GDPR. So somebody within an organization which is processing data, if they're not authorized to access that data and they do so, that is a data breach. If data is inaccessible when it's supposed to be accessible, that would be considered as a data breach under GDPR. If data is accidentally deleted or rendered unusable, then that is considered as a data breach under GDPR. So a data breach isn't just about somebody coming in and taking something. A data breach is unauthorized processing of personal data.
Right. Yeah. And why should, go ahead.
Maybe because you should tell a little bit about what GDPR is.
Yeah.
Okay, so GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, is the new law in Europe which replaces the old Data Protection Directive from 1995. There are many similarities between the two pieces of law. One of the big changes is the previous law was a directive, which is secondary legislation, which meant we had 28 different versions of it across Europe, which was very difficult for companies to be able to comply with because different countries had different definitions of various aspects of what should be in the law and how that law should be enforced. As a regulation, which is primary legislation, the GDPR is the same across all member states, soon to be 27 because obviously we have Brexit occurring in March next year. And it's a very principle-based approach. So it uses principles on how data should be processed. It defines what processing is. So processing of data is any activity on data which is being done in an organized fashion. So in an organized file system or some other form. And that includes erasure, collection, transportation, dissemination. I mean, the list is fairly long. You can look it up in the GDPR, but it doesn't really change from the previous directive. There are some extra data subject rights under GDPR, such as the ability to have your data moved, or data portability, as it's called in GDPR, move your data from one service to another. We have extended rights to deletion, which are the result of the right to be forgotten under the previous directive. There are You have the right to have processing suspended in a situation where you have a complaint or you have a dispute over the data that's being processed. Obviously, there are higher penalties under GDPR than we had under the previous directive. So there are two types of penalties. The minor penalty is 2% or 10 million euros, whichever is higher as a maximum penalty. And then the second penalty is 4% or 20 million euros, whichever is higher. And depending on the type of breach of the law, depends on which of those penalties you receive. The higher breach is relevant for most cases, actually. So things regarding things like consent, transparency, etc., would all fall under the 4% or 20 million euros bucket. That said, it's unlikely that regulators will often enforce these maximum penalties. They're not really in the business of trying to penalize companies. They'd rather companies do the right thing. So they try and work with organizations who are doing the wrong thing, give them instructions on how they can do that better. That doesn't mean there won't be penalties, and we've seen some already, such as a hospital in Portugal. Germany had a penalty just last week, and these will increase over the coming months as some of the initial complaints that were filed in May early this year draw to the end of their investigations, and enforcement actions take place as a result. But GDPR is also an enabler. So many people consider that GDPR is an obstacle, it's a hurdle, something to overcome. But GDPR enables the transfer of personal data across European member states. Without GDPR, you wouldn't be able to do this. You would have to have treaties between each member state in order to transfer that data. We also have safeguards in place for transferring data outside of the European Union. So, for example, standard contractual clauses or an adequacy decision by the European Commission, such as Japan just received very recently. In the US, there is currently Privacy Shield, although how long that will last remains to be seen. It's currently on the way to the Court of Justice of the European Union, along with standard contractual clauses as part of a complaint against Facebook in Ireland. There are a couple of other safeguards of transfer, such as codes of conduct or certifications. But generally speaking, in order to be able to transfer data relating to European citizens or people in Europe, not just citizens, anybody in Europe, outside of the EU, requires that there be an adequate level of data protection in the country where that data is being transferred to. And often we see that isn't happening. Yeah. Right. So, for example, I wrote an article just yesterday about a bike sharing app, which is transferring a whole bunch of data to China. That's illegal under GDPR without a relevant safeguard in place. And from what I can see, there's no safeguard in this case.
So is GDPR favoring large companies? I mean, is it easier for large companies to just pay a fine and not worry about it?
People say that. Some people say that. Certainly, there's an element of truth to that. So under the previous directive, the fines were unsubstantial. You know, that you would see the maximum penalty in the UK, for example, was £500,000, which to a company like Facebook or Google or Microsoft, I mean, it's a couple of seconds worth of revenues, literally. It's not really something that's going to deeply concern them. Under GDPR, the penalties are much higher. So, for example, the Marriott breach we could see being in the hundreds of millions of euros. The Google breach recently on the Google API, that could be over €1 billion, depending on how the regulators decide to enforce that penalty. But what's more important, I think, when it comes to breaches under GDPR, they create a lot of headlines. I mean, when was last week you had where you didn't see a headline about a breach in the past couple of years? They create a lot of headlines. This creates a lot of reputational damage. It damages the trust between the users of those services and those service providers. It potentially weakens market share. It lowers loyalty. If you look at Facebook, for example, in their second quarterly earnings call this year in July, their CFO came onto the call and stated that GDPR had seen a significant decline in the number of users in the EU. This immediately cost Facebook $120 billion off their share price, as their share price collapsed later that day. And now it's over 200 billion they've lost since July 27th, which is around 43% or 47% of their market value. No, 37% of their market value since July. You know, and a company like Facebook, in some cases, they can absorb that loss, although this is a really big problem for Facebook currently. Smaller companies, you know, medium to large enterprises that aren't of the behemoth size of Facebook, etc., they're going to struggle significantly if they face that type of reputational damage from not complying with the law.
Right.
I say this when I'm speaking to corporates every week. You know, Facebook can perhaps afford a 200 billion loss. I pretty much guarantee that you can't. Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
correct.
I mean, there's both monetary issues, but also, of course, reputation. I mean, that's the other thing. Well, long term, if that continues, I mean, reputation will be ruined.
Yeah. And there's room in the market, and I've been talking about this for the last 10 years or so. There's a lot of room in the market to use privacy and strong data ethics as a competitive differentiator, using this as a unique selling position to compete in the market and to offer something that your competitors do not offer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what you offer, what we offer at IDCA that's different.
Yeah, I mean, the IDCA is based on, as I said in the beginning, that to protect people's privacy, to offer a place where you keep your privacy, you own your data, and you have a place to communicate, share, and store in groups, private groups, between family members, between friends, in a company, in an organization. So that's the whole idea, and people should know that they own their data. If they delete something, it's gone, and they have control over who is seeing it and who they share with. No one can buy access to anyone. It's only between people that you know, that you communicate, or within groups that you participate. So the whole idea of it is to do something totally different from other social collaboration networks that are existing. So it's like a upside down on social networks, I would say.
What do you think about that, Alexander? Just from your point of view, do you think this is possible, that we can have a not ad-driven economy and services like IDCA that actually people will get used to using, or is it too far a switch?
I'm an optimist, so I'm not going to say it's too far, but it is very difficult. I was at the European Parliament at the end of October. You were there also, Goran. Listening to Giovanna Butarelli talking about putting the dignity back into digital, and how strong we need to be to face the issues relating to data ethics. And one of the biggest problems we face is competition. So when you look at companies like Facebook with billions of users, when you look at companies like Google with billions of users, to create an opposing model to those systems is not just a case of creating something which is better from a privacy perspective. Everybody likes more privacy. The difficulty is people have invested so much time and energy into these social networks, mm-hmm. and into and developing their social graphs, that to move to a new system or a new service isn't just a case of their own personal choice. There's a great deal of pressure of how do they take their friends with them. Yeah. So when you create these new services, it's great. It's wonderful that these services exist. But what we need some more action from competition regulators, such as the European Commission, Competition Commissioner, to be able to say to these behemoths, look, this isn't okay anymore. We already have data portability under GDPR, but even then, taking your data is only a very small piece of the puzzle. You need to persuade as much of your social network or your social graph to move as well. Otherwise, you're effectively ostracizing yourself from those communities. And that's where the difficulty lies. And how do we deal with that? I don't yet have the answer. I think there is room for some antitrust work in this space. Certainly one of the things I lobby for in Brussels is for more competition and a more fair playing field. I think it might be useful that in situations where these large companies like Facebook are not obeying the law, which they currently aren't, there's no question as to whether or not they're obeying the law, should perhaps not be allowed to do business in these markets. And as distressing as that may be for people who use Facebook on a day-to-day basis, sometimes you just got to rip off the plaster or rip off the Band-Aid. Yeah. And if the only way we can make sure that our fundamental rights, and bearing in mind, these are fundamental rights. This isn't just a bunch of people with tinfoil hats. Under Article 7 and Article 8 of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, privacy and data protection are fundamental rights. And we shouldn't allow these rights to just be ignored because of the convenience of market economics, especially when those economics are mostly being siphoned out of the region that is creating them in the first place into tax havens. So it's a very big problem. We need some more action from competition regulators around the world, perhaps breaking up these organizations. A lot of talk at the moment to break up Facebook and all the various companies that, all the various services that Facebook provides into separate companies. It has worked in the past. We've seen this type of action in the past with Microsoft, for example. How effective it would be on a company that has many billions of users remains to be seen. But certainly we cannot allow the status quo to maintain. It's not fair for organizations such as IDCA, and there are many other privacy-focused companies out there, having to compete in a regulatory environment where the competition is not playing by the same rules. And that is something which needs to be addressed. And it's something which should be addressed, and certainly within the jurisdiction of being addressed by competition or the antitrust regulators.
Yeah. But another question, I mean, one challenge that I see, I mean, that is how to develop knowledge amongst people about all this, because I still, despite everything that has been written in papers all over the world now, more and more, still most people hasn't have a clue what's going on. I mean, the one thing, as an example, when we talk about data, you can download your Facebook or Google data. But what's very seldom talked about is how that data is turned into profiles, what it really means. I mean, if you say you like something here and there, but people doesn't understand that that could mean that you are regarded as a Democrat, or that you are have a sexual deviation or whatever. All this algorithmic manipulation or calculation of these data into profiles is what most people doesn't have a clue about.
And this is another difficulty, and this moves on to a different issue. So before I talked about the Hawthorne effect under psychology, there's another phenomenon in psychology called psychographic profiling. And this was first developed in psychographics.
Yeah.
So this was first developed in the early 20th century by a psychologist to improve marketing campaigns as a means to try and develop a more successful marketing. And effectively, psychographics, the way psychographics works is it's an attack on our psychology. And because it's something which is attacking our psychology, our subconscious, it's not something that we're aware is going on. So if you think about the Cambridge Analytica scandal as a very good example of this, by triggering certain emotional responses through manipulating our psychology, people were making decisions that were not their own decisions, and would potentially not be decisions that they would make without these types of manipulation occurring. I call them micro nudges. So, you know, when you go online, you see thousands of advertisements per day, thousands of advertisements a day. And within those advertisements may be often referred to as fake news or psychographic profiling that we hear so much about with regards to election campaigns, etc. Within those advertisements, there's guaranteed nowadays to be some form of psychographic profiling taking place. And I'm having a webinar on this next week, actually, about whether or not it's ethical to allow psychographics in any environment. So there's a big push against the use of psychographics currently for political campaigns. Yeah, we shouldn't be allowed to use these for political campaigns because it taints with the authenticity of the results of those elections. But at the same time, if it's not okay for political campaigns, is it okay for retail or consumer goods marketing? Are we being forced, or are we being persuaded or manipulated to buy products and services that we neither need nor would ever buy if our psychology wasn't being attacked in this way? So one of my biggest areas of work over the past 10 years has been on behavioral or psychographic profiling, and the risks that poses both to us as individuals and to society as a whole, where we get to the point where, as you said before, we lose our self-identity. We're no longer in control of ourselves. So from the one side, we're being observed all the time, which triggers similar things such as the Hawthorne effect, where we change our behavior, we change the people we associate with, et cetera, et cetera. And on the other side, we're being manipulated into changing our behavior at the subconscious level that we're not aware of, and buying products and services that we would never ordinarily buy, voting for people we would never ordinarily vote for, and reacting to news articles and stimuli that we would not normally be associated with. So this is a very serious problem, one that is incredibly difficult to overcome whilst the current state of affairs exists with regards to the behavioral profiling people online. And as I said, because this is in the subconscious, you can't detect it. Neither you or I or anybody else who's listened to this show will know that the decisions they make are genuine decisions that they've made themselves. We're effectively all under the control at the moment of large multinational corporations or billionaires or foreign governments who are pushing these psychographic stimuli into our visual space and making us behave in a way that we would not ordinarily behave. So as much as we like to think we're in control of the decisions we make, even I, who's acutely aware of these issues, cannot guarantee that my psychology is not being manipulated in a way which is making me make decisions I would not ordinarily make.
But I mean, this is the essence and the core of an ad-based business model. That's exactly what they aim to do. They aim to manipulate people to act in a way that they intend them to act.
Yeah, but I mean, just as we did in the 1970s, where we banned subliminal advertising on television because it was attacking our subconscious and we had no control over it, the same should be true for behavioral advertising, because it has exactly the same impact. It's an aspect of our personality, of ourself, that we do not have any control over. You know, when you attack somebody's psychology, you're attacking something they do not control.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
So what's in your perfect world, Goran?
In my perfect world, well, that was a small question.
I mean, how would you like to see things change, and are you as optimistic as Alexander is?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think the issue of privacy and things that we have been discussing here is one of our bigger questions today in society. It's, together with climate and a couple of other things, the most essential issue. And this surveillance and this manipulation that is going on now has to disappear, because it's too dangerous for us, and it's not only dangerous for ourselves in terms of individuals, but it's extremely dangerous for the society. And we see now around the world how democratic systems have been teared down and manipulated very dangerously. And Alexander, you spoke about China, and what's going on there is, I mean, that's like the utopia of something that is so bad for society. And I mean, you can imagine how people in China, when this is implemented in full, how their lives would be. Mm-hmm. It's really mm-hmm. terrible. And I don't know. I think I came to the conclusion. One of the main issues here is, in terms of solutions, is that the ad-based business model will not solve these problems. That would make it more and more worse and worse. And somehow I start myself to question whether it should be allowed to have this kind of ad-based business models at all, because the incentives of doing harm is so big.
I mean, look what's going on in China with the social ranking, Russia and political meddling, Sri Lanka, and so many societies, that it's really threatening democracies, right? Isn't that what we're talking about?
Yeah, and I mean, the only way forward is to have alternatives like ITCA and other platforms that really protects privacy and also, I mean, I think as you said, Alexander, as well, in the early days, I mean, when internet came, that was like freedom thing, that you could reach people, you can talk about things, discuss things in another way than you ever have done before. And the only way to get back to that is that people feel safe and secure and know that their privacy is protected.
Yeah, I mean, 10 years ago, I stood before the European Parliament and the European Commission and said that I didn't think we should ban behavioral advertising, that we should give people the choice, and that we should go down the route of consent, informed consent, you know, where people make a genuine choice. Because I didn't feel it was my place to tell people what they should and shouldn't be allowed to see online. Now, my attitude has changed. I think behavioral advertising should be banned, period. The risks to society are simply too great. All this data which is being collected, even if it's only ever used for advertising, is manipulating us in ways which is simply unacceptable. But the fact of the matter is once this data is collected, it never disappears. So it can be used over and over again for multiple purposes, whether that be political campaigning, whether that be surveillance, whether that be to curb freedom of speech and freedom of movement in societies where you're seen as a dissident, whether that be for the selling of goods and services via advertising and marketing in ways that you would never normally purchase these products and services. There are too many risks associated with behavioral or psychographic profiling, and it should quite simply be outlawed. And the penalties for the use of this should be criminal penalties. We cannot sit back and allow this to be served or enforced via meaningless monetary penalties, even if those penalties are in the millions of dollars. It has no real impact and there's no real persuasion for companies to behave ethically. We've had 20 years where we've tried to allow companies in these industries to self-regulate, and they've just become worse and worse and worse. Even now after GDPR, we're still seeing a huge number of companies are not compliant. I would say less than 10% of companies globally are compliant with GDPR. And I work in this space every single day. You know, they're not compliant with the e-privacy directive or the upcoming e-privacy regulation. And most of the compliance issues come from digital marketing. And digital marketing. And this is another thing which makes it very difficult for privacy conscious and privacy enhancing services. How do they market their services in an ethical way when the only marketing options available nowadays are them very selves violating privacy and in breach of the law? So how can you compete if you don't have a marketing opportunity which is legal and fair against companies who control your competitors in the space, such as Facebook in your case, are also the people controlling these marketing networks? Yeah, so there's some very serious dilemmas that need to be addressed. As I said before, I think a big part of that should be by the antitrust regulators. Some of these companies absolutely should be broken up into smaller entities, and the penalties should be criminal penalties, where somebody, if they are in breach or they're responsible for a breach of the law in a situation which is having a dramatic impact on our society, our democracy, our fundamental rights, they should go to prison, and they should go to prison for a long time.
Yeah. Another question, how do you see, I mean, we know now around the world there are many countries or governments that are using social media to harass and to divide people in the countries. I mean, we see Myanmar, we've seen it in India, we've seen it in the Philippines, of course. What is your thought about that? Well, how should we treat or deal with these kind of problems that we see now growing all over the world?
Again, if the use of psychographics was banned, and the situation in Myanmar was very similar to the situation with the Trump administration, with Brexit, with the French elections, with the Swedish elections recently, you know, with the German elections and the Belgian elections and the Dutch elections, which have all seen strong right-wing propaganda and fake news campaigns during the run-up to these elections, and have led to results which we genuinely believe as a global population are not true, are not honest, are the result of manipulation through fake news. Similar situation with the Myanmar crisis. If these activities were banned globally under international law, then we could take actions against these countries who are doing this as well. And if these services were not permitted to be provided, so if you look at the likes of Facebook, for the example that you were looking at there, if Facebook were banned as a corporate entity from providing these types of services, then these governments would not have an avenue to push this in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, also in those countries, many of those countries at least, Facebook is the only internet access that they have.
Yes.
Yeah. An assault on the psychology of a person is just as bad, if not worse, as a physical assault on that person.
Right.
Yeah.
And the damage can be far more significant.
Yeah.
So all right, so now we've painted a pretty good picture of how bad things are out there. What are the next steps? I mean, what's the future?
We have to keep fighting, that's for sure. We just launched the world's first pro-privacy lobby group, which will be launching on January 1st, which is for companies like IDCA, privacy-focused companies who want to have an equal say, or at least have a voice politically in Brussels, in DC, etc. Currently, most of the lobbying that exists is either done by anti-privacy focused companies who are trying to weaken our laws and weaken our fundamental rights, or NGOs who have very limited resources. Now we're seeing an emerging market of a large number of companies coming into this space who have seen the benefits of privacy, who are using privacy as a competitive differentiator. Some of the biggest company, in fact, the biggest company in the world is very privacy focused. I know you use it because I can see from your username on the screen. You know, so there's a very good and solid story for privacy. You know, if the most successful company in the world use privacy as one of their core features in their products, then surely that's something that we should be embracing and something we should be happy and smiling about. So by forming this new lobby group, we're now in a position where the industry, or the privacy industry, now have a voice in politics and can start to influence public policy and legislation moving forward. This is something new. It's something we're very excited about, but we also need to encourage new companies to keep coming forward. We need to see new technologies emerge, and we need to see a strong focus on the principles of privacy by design, security by design, and by default. And however difficult it is for services like IDCA to break into the market, given the overwhelming pressure from these larger companies like Facebook controlling these markets, we shouldn't allow that to deter us, because if we don't try, then things will just continue to get worse and worse. So we can't be defeated. We have to, you know, the world is changing. There's no question that the world is becoming more privacy focused. Even in the last 6 months since the implementation of GDPR, we've seen global changes. We've seen a new law in California. We've seen new law in Brazil. We've seen a new law in Nigeria, you know, and other African states. So we're seeing a genuine push where GDPR is effectively being used as a template for other countries and other states within federal countries to move forward and develop law which is more respectful and more ethical with regards to our fundamental right to privacy. So we can see this as a very positive thing as well. Convention 108, which is a European Council of the European Convention from 1980 or 81, I think, 1981, has recently seen a significant increase in the number of signatories who see Convention 108 as a stepping stone towards GDPR compliance and being able to do business in Europe. And when you consider Europe is the biggest economy on the planet, you know, being able to access that market is very important. So that can be a driver as well. If we as a region, if the European Union state, we will not allow you to do business in this region if you do not comply with our laws, which is effectively what we've done with GDPR, then that's a very good driver to try and persuade both companies and other nation states to implement and obey laws which are more respectful of our privacy. But the key here is we must enforce these laws. We can't have the situation we had over the past 20, 25 years where we had strong laws and they just weren't enforced. So we now have a very good opportunity with GDPR. We must make sure that the regulators follow through with that and have the powers and have the resources to enforce these laws appropriately.
Yeah. I have an additional question there. I mean, we were both on this Nordic Privacy Conference a few weeks ago in Stockholm. I mean, there was a couple of things that I brought with me after that. And one thing is that, if I generalize now, there was many lawyers there in the public, and I had like a feeling that most of them didn't like fight so much for privacy. It was more like to get contracts with customers around GDPR, and you also saw who some people that were speaking there was like anti privacy organizations and got big room on stage there, for instance. Do you agree with me on that?
This is something which isn't new. There's a very big conference in Brussels every year called CPDP, which is Conference for Data Protection and Privacy. And in the earlier years of this conference, it was very much focused on academics, privacy advocates, politicians, some lawyers. But in recent years, it's become very dominated by corporations. I mean, companies like Palantir sponsoring. Palantir, one of the biggest surveillance companies on the planet, sponsoring an event about privacy and data protection. And I from the one side, I can understand how people say, well, they need to be involved in the conversation as well. But on the other side, it really rubs me the wrong way to see companies like this being given primary access to speaking opportunities at events focused on privacy and data protection. And effectively, we call it privacy whitewashing, where they go on, and we see it with Facebook all the time. They go on stage. They've done this in the European Parliament. They've done this at every event I've seen them at. They go on stage and say, well, we have to be able to do this. Otherwise, we can't help deaf people, or we can't help blind people, or we can't help people with some other disability. And I'm sorry, but the ends do not justify the means. Because you may do some little piece of good, it doesn't mean that all the bad you do is suddenly washed away. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, this is a problem we have in the event space generally. It's a problem we have in the press as well. One of the bigger problems we have in reporting on these issues is the press are responsible for most of the privacy violations we see on a day-to-day basis. When's the last time you went to a popular press website that didn't have 60, 70, even 150 tracking technologies embedded in their web pages? So you're trying to persuade the press to talk about these things, but their bottom lines depend on using exactly these same privacy violating technologies as the ones we're trying to get fixed. So we don't even have any neutrality in the press. We see some of the stories come forward, but unless it's something dramatic and something sexy, it isn't really going to be reported in the mainstream press. And I've attacked the press on this many, many times. I've spoken at their own private events. I've spoken at public consultations, at political events, et cetera, and they just don't seem to see the hypocrisy that they're currently responsible for. So it's a big problem. There's no question it's a big problem. There's not equal representation. There's not neutrality in the press. And until the laws start to be enforced, and this is really what is going to make a difference. If the laws are enforced, then the people responsible for breaking those laws will start to change their behavior. If the laws aren't enforced, they will continue to do exactly the same thing that they've been doing for the past 20 years. So really, this is a call out to the regulators and the enforcement bodies that they really have to do their job. And this isn't a case of, oh, well, we can't upset this company because they create X amount of jobs, et cetera, et cetera. We can't discount the bad things that a company does just because it does a little good.
Right.
The laws exist for a reason. If we don't enforce those laws, not only are those laws meaningless, but are effectively responsible for weakening our fundamental rights. Any regulator in Europe which does not enforce GDPR or the e-privacy directive are directly responsible for the erosion of our fundamental rights under the European Charter. Because by not enforcing the law, they're sending a clear message to violators that this is okay.
Right. Yeah? Guys, we're out of time, but I want to thank you, Alexander, for joining us. It's been
my great pleasure.
And we're going to continue this conversation, have Alexander back to talk to people, and people are going to be calling in with questions. So to be continued, and let's hope for the best.
Yeah, and we all have to keep fighting.
That's right.
The movement has started.
Yeah.
It is a movement. Definitely. It is a
it's
movement.
It's a movement. It's a movement that's got a very long tail, that's been moving for a long time, but it's like a tidal wave. The closer it gets to shore, the more it swells. Yeah.
There you go.
So we will see. Yeah. Well, I think I'm positive. The world has changed in a very positive way in the last year or so. And we're seeing more and more companies coming forward in the space. We just have to make sure that enforcement is key. No question.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. All right, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. Talk soon.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.